In 1873, support for the continuation of Reconstruction was waning. Southern Democrats began to use this opportunity to begin slowly taking back control of former Confederate states. These Democrats were known as Redeemers, and they pushed for democratic control of the Solid South. The Mississippi Plan of 1875 was developed by conservative white Democrats as a part of the White Rebellion during the Reconstruction era in the southern United States. It was devised by the Democratic Party in that state to overthrow the Republican Party in Mississippi by means of organized threats of violence and suppression or purchase of the black vote. Democrats wanted to regain political control of the legislature and governor's office. Their success in doing so led to similar plans being adopted by white Democrats in South Carolina and other majority black states. Henry W. Grady, the editor of the Atlanta Constitution, a newspaper in Georgia's capital city, had a new vision for the South. In a series of impassioned public speeches and articles, Grady envisioned a Southern economy enriched with broadly expanding manufacturing facilities and commerce. Grady and like-minded Southerners referred to this regional economic remake as the New South. There were some New South successes. Birmingham, Alabama prospered from iron and steel manufacturing, and mining and furniture production benefited other parts of the South. Likewise, James Duke made use of newly invented cigarette rolling machines to feed the growing market for tobacco and founded the American Tobacco Company in North Carolina in 1890. Kentuckians will use its corn and wheat to kickstart the bourbon industry towards the end of the century. The most notable New South initiative was the introduction of textile mills in the South. Beginning in the early 1880s, Northern capitalists invested in building textile mills in the southern Appalachian foothills of North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, drawn to the region by the fact that they could pay Southern mill workers at half the rate of the workers in Northern mills. Due to these low wages, the mills gave only a modest boost to the Southern economies in which they were built. During the Civil War, most of the Southern railroads were destroyed. During Reconstruction, Southern states will build new railroads of the same size gauge as railroads in the North and the West to facilitate interstate commerce. After Reconstruction, the South will build a bigger network of railroads, including a transcontinental railroad that goes through the South. Between 1880 and 1890, the South will more than double the amount of railroad tracks. W.E.B. Du Bois was an African-American writer, teacher, sociologist, and activist whose work transformed the way the lives of black citizens were seen in American society. Considered ahead of his time, Du Bois was an early advocate for political rights and social equality for the black community. Booker T. Washington was born into slavery and rose to become a leading African-American intellectual in the 19th century, founding the Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute in 1881. Washington believed in creating economic opportunity for blacks, which in turn would lead to gradual social equality. The position of the federal government was that they would provide opportunity for blacks with no guarantees of social equality. Jim Crow laws were a collection of state and local statutes that legalized racial segregation. Named after a black minstrel show character, the laws, which existed for about 100 years from the post-Civil War era until 1968, were meant to marginalize African Americans by denying them the right to vote, hold jobs, get an education, or other opportunities. Those who attempted to defy Jim Crow laws often faced arrest, fines, jail sentences, violence, and even death. Literacy tests were used to keep people of color, and sometimes poor whites, from voting, and they were administered at the discretion of officials in charge of voter registration. If the official wanted a person to pass, he could ask the easiest question on the test. For example, who is the President of the United States? The same official might require a black person to answer every single question correctly in an unrealistic amount of time in order to pass. Begun in the 1890s as a legal way to keep African Americans from voting in southern states, poll taxes were essentially a voting fee. Eligible voters were required to pay their poll tax before they could cast a ballot. A grandfather clause excused some poor whites from payment if they had an ancestor who voted before the Civil War, but there were no exemptions for African Americans. Plessy v. Ferguson was a landmark 1896 U.S. Supreme Court decision that upheld the constitutionality of racial segregation under the separate but equal doctrine. The case stemmed from an 1892 incident in which African American train passenger Homer Plessy refused to sit in a car for blacks. Rejecting Plessy's argument that his constitutional rights were violated, the Supreme Court ruled that the Jim Crow law implies merely a legal distinction between whites and blacks and was not unconstitutional. As a result, restrictive Jim Crow legislation and separate public accommodations based on race became common throughout the South. These policies were in place until the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education case deemed them unconstitutional. The 1890s saw a dramatic increase in lynching. There was an average of 187 lynchings per year. 80% of them occurred in the South. A black person would be lynched by these vigilante groups for two reasons. Number one, for committing a crime or being accused of committing a crime, or number two, for trying to exercise their newfound rights and freedoms. These lynchings served as an intimidation tool by white supremacists to suppress black newfound freedoms. Another landmark Supreme Court case was the Slaughterhouse cases of 1883. Here are the facts of the case. Louisiana had created a partial monopoly of the slaughtering business and gave it to one company. Competitors argue that this created involuntary servitude, abridged their privileges and immunities, and denied equal protection of the laws, and also deprived them of liberty and property without due process of law. The question the court had to answer was, did the creation of the monopoly violate the 13th and 14th Amendments? The court concluded that the state of Louisiana did not violate the 13th and 14th Amendments. States are allowed to limit the right to use property. There was no involuntary servitude because that applies to people. The Equal Protection Clause doesn't apply because it was established to avoid laws discriminating against blacks. The court said that the Privileges and Immunities Clause was interpreted to apply to national citizenship, not state citizenship. This diagram summarizes Reconstruction and clearly illustrates the back-and-forth nature of the policies passed by Congress and the Southern states. It begins, of course, with presidential Reconstruction and the Southern reaction to the 13th Amendment, the Black Codes. And Congress steps in and takes over Reconstruction, passing strict policies to ensure the rights of the newly freed blacks. The South responds with violence and rebellion, causing Congress to clamp down even tighter with new policies. Finally, Reconstruction shifts to Southern control and the rights of blacks are taken away. It all culminates with the Supreme Court upholding the Jim Crow laws in Plessy v. Ferguson. Why does the Supreme Court uphold the Jim Crow laws? Traditionally, the Supreme Court decisions reflect the views and philosophy of society at the time. They were unwilling to force the integration of American society. It won't be until the 1950s that this process would begin. The biggest economic failure of Reconstruction was the failure to protect black economic rights and opportunities. It failed to allow African Americans to acquire land and to provide adequate education for skilled industrial workers in the South. The greatest economic success of Reconstruction was the creation of a black middle class. You saw growth in urban blacks, property owners, teachers, doctors, lawyers, nurses, businessmen, and bankers, all coming back to their neighborhoods and serving their own people. 25% of blacks were wage earners. You saw an increase in black income by 46%. Overall, they worked shorter hours than they did during slavery. White income actually decreased during this period, 33%. About 40% of blacks became educated in comparison to 50% of whites. So how did urban whites react to this? This is where you see the growth in the Jim Crow laws and lynchings. Here are the results of the Civil War and Reconstruction. Ultimately, we see the supremacy of the federal government over the states. The Republicans dominate the federal government, but it leads to division in the Republican Party. We see the passage of the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th. You see a broadening of democracy with African American men being able to vote. The Democrats, however, will dominate the South. You will also see an expansion in the federal government's powers. You'll also see the political empowerment of blacks as more and more blacks can vote. It leads to multiple economic changes that we discussed, and then the rebirth of the women's movement as a result of being left out of the 15th Amendment.